You're listening to the Max Planck Lawcast, which showcases the academic research currently being conducted across the Max Planck Law Network. I'm your host, Christopher Murphy, and together we'll be talking to some of the more than 400 researchers who are pushing the frontiers of legal knowledge in Germany and abroad. When it comes to new and exciting legal research, the Lawcast has you covered. Well, welcome to another episode of the Max Planck Lawcast. Thanks so much for tuning in today, wherever you may be. On today's episode, we are going to be talking about, or looking more closely at, the concept of independence within the European Union. While the EU represents a bonding of countries, pooling together certain resources, elements, and the sovereignty for the greater collective benefit, each member state certainly, as well as its institutions of the EU, maintains its distinct identity and autonomy. In many ways, the EU could be seen as a complex dance between independence and interdependence. But what exactly does independence mean within the EU, and how do member states retain their sovereignty while committing to shared principles and regulations? And of course, it's not just the member states, there are also the EU institutions, which, while designed to be independent, have on occasion had this called into question. In this episode, I'm joined by Antoine Vauchez to explore how independence is understood within the European Union. Antoine is a professor at the French National Centre for Scientific Research, specialising in political sociology and law. Moreover, he has recently published an article on today's topic, a link to which you can find in the podcast description. Antoine is also a Max Planck Law Fellow, running the research group Independence and Democracy in the EU. So I think he's very well equipped to answer today's questions. Antoine, welcome to the Lawcast.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's wonderful to have you on here. I said you published it recently, but you just told me it's a bit older, the article.
It has been a long-standing research path for me. So, I'm, of course, still working on the topic, but the paper indeed was published a year and a half ago.
Okay, rightio. But as I said, I'll put a link onto that. It's open access, I gather, as well.
Great.
Okay, wonderful. Right, so let's start then. You coined this term independence wars to identify critical junctures and crises that have come to define what independence means within the European Union. Can you elaborate a little on why you chose this term, which I find particularly catchy, and how these wars, I guess, have shaped the EU?
Well, yes, thank you for the question. Usually when we refer to independence wars, we think more, for example, of the United States independence war against the colonizer and all over Africa in the independence wars of the 1950s or 60s. And it refers more in a way to the rise of political sovereignty against the colonizer. And I was struck by the fact that, in a way, the independence or the autonomy of the EU, of the European Union, ever since the 1950s, when it started to grow in competence and in field and in policy fields, that this autonomy of the European Union vis-a-vis the member states was gained essentially by claiming the independence of its institutions, the independence, of course, of the European Court of Justice, the independence of the Commission, and later the independence of the European Central Bank. So in a way, the political sovereignty of the European Union, or the share of sovereignty that the European Union has progressively acquired vis-a-vis member state, has been acquired, taken through the notion not of political independence, but of independence of non-majoritarian institutions such as courts, central bank, or the Commission, which is, of course, a great regulator of the single market.
And would you say then, because you use the term war then, meaning that sometimes this independence has not been given over willingly?
Well, of course, the word war is to be taken in more symbolic meaning, vis-a-vis particularly the wars of independence in the 50s or vis-a-vis colonization. So, this is probably where the metaphor comes to a limit. Mm-hmm. But yes, indeed, given the importance that this notion of independence has taken, I think, given also the dependence, in a way, of the European Union on this notion when it comes to justify its competence, its jurisdiction in terms of policy. Think about the monetary policy of the ECB, or think about the regulatory policy of the European Commission. So its dependence on this notion has the consequence that all the battles over the competence, of all the conflicts of competence that have emerged vis-a-vis the member states, and there have been many over the years, over the decades of European integration. Well, these battles often, not always, but often, and this is what I claim in the paper, take place around a debate over what independence means. Who is independent? How should we understand the limits, the scope of independence? To what extent should the European Central Bank be independent from national central banks, for example, the Bundesbank in particular in Germany? To what extent should national constitutional courts, for example, in Hungary or in Poland, be independent from the decisions of the European Union, for example, the values of European Union in terms of the rule of law or in terms of democracy standards? So, I mean, we keep on coming back to what it means to be independent. Who are these institutions independent from? So this is really a battleground. And what the article does is to somehow retrace the history of this entanglement between the European Union polity and this notion of independence.
Okay, I mean, because we obviously keep coming back now, this independence, such an important concept in the EU for seemingly the member states, the EU institutions. In a nutshell, why does independence have such a pivotal and important role?
Well, I mean, the article traces a series of critical junctures in which precisely this entanglement has been defined or has coalesced in a way from the 1960s up until today. Again, I think there is a clear connection between moments of expansion of EU competences and its reliance on the notion of independence. So in the 1960s, and this somehow is the first step of the article and this research, when it came to define who would be the builders of the market, of this borderless market, or at least borderless within, of course, the remit of the member states, when it came to build the legitimacy of the Commission, the legitimacy of the courts, then the notion of independence became critical, because it was through that notion that these two institutions justified the trust that should be given to them, the fact that they wouldn't be favoring one country vis-a-vis the other, not favoring, for example, the big member states vis-a-vis the small member states, the fact also that these institutions had a sense of the long-term interest of the European project, not just the short-termism of politics. At least that's the way they would actually justify their power. So the fact that also they could claim expertise, and expertise that was not just national, but an expertise that would be, sort of pan-European outlook of what it takes to build a common market or later a single market. So in a way, I think this has somehow defined the importance of independence in the political grammar of the European Union.
Okay.
And the political grammar in particular, of course, of the supranational pole, the Commission, the Court, and of course, later on, and that's another critical moment, the rise of the European Central Bank, which is the sort of über-independent institution in the EU.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, actually, we'll come to the independence, particularly of these EU institutions in a tick. But I think before we go any further, it would obviously be remiss to not talk about what certainly in the media are often the battlegrounds that one hears about between the Commission and between the member states, the institutions and the member states, particularly individual member states. I gather these two are part of the independence wars. And if you answer that, my second question then would be, do these constant scuffles, small-scale battles between member states and institutions, do they strengthen the EU or do they weaken it?
I focus in particular in this research on the conflicts that have emerged around the notion of rule of law and the sort of the sharing of European values regarding what is Article 2 of the Lisbon Treaty, which puts forward the importance of the rule of law as one of the core values of the European Union. And of course, this has been one of the main conflicts between the European Commission and the member states with the rise of conservative governments, or sometimes extreme right governments, for that matter, in Central European countries. And what is interesting, of course, is that there is a constant, bickering, you could say, but at the same time, to face the challenge of the rise of conservative or extreme right governments and the attack on precisely national independent institutions. I'm thinking about regulators, national central banks, or national courts that these governments have been willing to control increasingly as they got to power. Well, then the Commission and the European Union as a whole tries to reinforce its arsenal of surveillance. And in particular, when it comes to the rule of law, on the independence of, again, these regulators, these courts, and these national central banks. So I guess this crisis that I describe all along this journey that the article is trying to retrace, each one of these crises is also a moment of reinforcement of the powers of the Commission in the name of protecting independence, in the name of protecting independence of European institutions, but also of their national counterparts. The counterpart of the Commission being national regulators, the counterpart of the ECB being national central banks, and the counterparts of the European Court of Justice being, national courts. And so there's a sort of ecosystem of independent institutions that is being protecting increasingly as crises come one after the other.
Okay, right. So from the rubble of the battles, the EU does in some ways, though, strengthen its structure. So it makes building blocks for this meshing between dependence and interdependence, if that's how I correctly understand you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. That's
right.
Exactly that.
Well, we're going to take a short break now. And then after this, I'll be back with Antoine. And we're going to talk more about not so much the member states, but more about the EU's institutions, their independence. And Antoine's already touched on the European Central Bank. That's going to be one of the key topics we take after the break.
Max Planck Law is a network of Max Planck Institutes engaging in legal research. The first of these was established in Berlin in 1924. Today, we cover a broad range of legal studies, from the anthropology of law to tax law. We operate one of the world's largest programs for doctoral and postdoctoral research in law. Visit our website today at law.mpg.de.
Welcome back to the Lawcast. I'm talking today with Antoine Vauchez about the concept of independence in the European Union. Antoine, let's now move to the independence of the European Union's institutions. I'm a lawyer by trade, but European law is even trickier. But I gather the institutions are basically the legislative, the executive, and the judicial bodies of the EU. Is that correct? In a nutshell? Okay, wonderful. Okay. So, how have the independence wars influenced the acceptance and autonomy of these institutions?
Well, certainly these institutions have been put increasingly under discussion or debate as they expanded their powers. Maybe we'll talk about the European Central Bank specifically later on, but it's clear that the court and the commission, as they have been integral to the making of, the la grande affaire of the European Union, which is, of course, the making of a market and the governing of that market. Of course, it has been increasingly difficult for these institutions to hide from the political radar, in a way, and to avoid being discussed in national political spheres.
They often seem to be taboo man, right? Certainly when you follow national politics, it's the EU, and when we talk about the EU, it's the institutions.
The institutions, of course, and you can take a number of decisions of the court or a number of decisions of the commission that have been perceived as not independent in a way, precisely, being highly criticized. So I think, yes, the difficulty of independent institutions is that if their burden expands in a way, I mean, their burden in terms of policy issues, in terms of redistributive scope, of course, it's increasingly difficult at the same time to avoid being politically, under the political radar and being, of course, at the core of political controversies. And so we are in this situation, we've been in that situation for, probably 2 or 3 decades, that this EU independence have at the same time keep on expanding, I think, their, the range of their competences, but the basis of their legitimacy remains very narrow because they are indeed independent institutions and elected institutions.
Unelected, exactly. Well, we've talked so much about independence. Independence is something that everyone wants. Everyone wants to be independent. The teenagers want to be independent. The institutions want to be independent. But the remit of these independent institutions has grown over time and seems to be continually growing. How are the institutions then actually held accountable for their actions if they are so independent?
Well, first of all, and that gets back to the beginning of your question, I think indeed independence is a tricky word. The role, and it's a tricky word, it's plastic, it's very contextual, very contingent in its definitions. It's not, historically stable. If you move from one period of the time or one member state, the notions of what it means to be an independent court are very different. But that's precisely, in a way, the difficulty, because if you want to hold these institutions accountable, then you have to define what it means to be independent and what are the limits, in a way, in a democratic system of, the range of competences that they can actually take in charge. So I think one of the purpose in the end, I think, of the paper and of this research is also that we collectively as scholars try to build a more robust understanding of what being an independent institution means in democracy. I think all the difficulty is that we need in a democracy independent institutions to allow for equality before the law and to indeed organize a system that is accessible for all, and particularly in a democracy. But at the same time, it's a condition of democracy, but it's also a limit of democracy because, of course, it's an unelected institution and its range of competencies, again, should be necessarily limited because of the democratic principle. So this is a very subtle balance, which is continuously moved. And that's why, as scholars, we should be particularly concerned or at least interested in looking at this term, which should really not be a sort of buzzword or a sort of unquestioned notion. It bears too many consequences today in our democracy to be left backstage.
Yes. All right. Well, I'm going to pose you a question now. Let's say, I'm sure a lot of EU officials will listen to our podcast and they'll say, oh, okay, there's some interesting paper here on the independence and also accountability of the institutions. And then they think, okay, we're often hit a lot by national parliaments, by European citizens. We're complex, we're bureaucrats in Brussels. What could the PR department of the EU institution, how could they kind of combat this oft-heard claim that important decisions that affect all Europeans are made primarily by unelected officials in the various EU independent institutions? What would a good argument for the PR officer be to say, no, that's not the case?
Well, I'm not sure that as a scholar, I'm an excellent PR. So, maybe this is something that could be discussed. But for sure, these institutions, they have a set of resources and titles of legitimacy. The goal of the paper is not to say that they're illegitimate. I'm just saying that as crises follow one after the other, the fuzziness of the notion of independence allows for increasing power that may be questionable when we are in a democracy. And indeed, I think independent institutions could claim that in the recent decades, the political has been very important in the EU in dealing with crises, in, just the COVID crisis and the many European summits that have dealt with, the COVID vaccines and the next generation EU investment plan, etc. So I'm not saying the political is absent, but the political is essentially present in terms of in dealing with crises. But when it comes to actually govern these policies on the long term, and when it comes to govern, the daily politics of the EU, I think these institutions play a critical role. And also, if I may add one point, the people who populate these institutions, even the courts, but also the European Central Bank, and they often have some connection to the political in their trajectories, in their personal trajectories. They're not recruited only among experts or unconnected experts, or, as critics would have on these institutions, saying, they're completely disconnected. They're a sort of cosmopolitan ruling class. I don't think this is true at all. I think these independent statesmen, as we could call them, are often very rooted in national bureaucracies or politics. But still, I think maybe we would need to rethink the notion of the independence to allow for these institutions to be more representative. If you think of the European Central Bank, there are many ways of conceiving the monetary policy, and I think the various streams or doctrines of monetary policy should be represented in the collège or in the board governing the bank. Just as in the Court of Justice, we know there are very conflicting positions on the scope of EU law and EU law primacy and supremacy, etc. And I think for that reason, independence should also go with representativeness of the variety of perspectives on EU law. So my claim in the end would be that independence is not the contrary of representativeness, and it should be made clear that independent institutions should also be taking this variety of positions and doctrines on board of their governing bodies.
Okay. It is actually the fact that the various voices across Europe are heard in these institutions. It's just not that it's maybe made so apparent to those on the outside.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. One quick question. You say that they're unelected, but that means then they're unelected by the people, the populace, but they are within their own structures. There are elections and the like that take place. Is that correct?
Well, they're chosen. If we think about commissioners, judges of the Court of Justice and central bankers, they're mostly chosen by government and then accepted by the European Council, or by the head of the Commission as we record this podcast, and Ursula von der Leyen new Commission is being constituted. And of course, so it's a negotiation, but clearly they're promoted by national governments. The problem is that while these independent statesmen, again, play a critical role at the level of the EU, the European Parliament, which in a way could, add political legitimacy to their nomination, remains very much marginal. It has a role in the nomination of commissioners, but in a way it comes a little late, and it's essentially about, do they have conflicts of interest in the domain that they actually regulate, etc.
Okay.
When it comes to judges of the court, the European Parliament has a very, very limited role. And when it comes to choosing governors of the European Central Bank, it's exactly the same. So, the problem in a way is that, yes, it's national politicians who choose these European statesmen, and the democratic poll or the democratic institution of the EU, which is the European Parliament, remains very much a marginal player.
Well, let's actually then turn now to the concept of money. European Central Bank, the ECB, one of the EU's, without doubt, most important institutions. Its primary mandate is to maintain price stability and manage monetary policy in the Eurozone. I think everyone can agree on that. The issue is, though, that monetary policy is directly related to the political and economic fortunes of the EU. So, question, is the ECB truly independent?
It claims to be, certainly. Well, you're right. The European Central Bank has been conceived as a super independent institution in a way, but that project has encountered in a way the many financial and economic crises of the 2000 and 2010s, and in that context, it has proved increasingly complicated for the ECB to claim to be external in a way to the economic stakes or the financial stakes of the member states. So it has been forced, as remember the famous whatever it takes of Draghi, that was a way of recognizing that the European Central Bank was completely part of the European project and could not somehow close its eyes in the name of independence. And through the Eurogroup, which brings together the finance ministers of all member states, where the ECB opens the debate each time there is a meeting and somehow gives the expertise and the range of possibilities. Of course, the ECB is completely part of the governance of the Eurozone. I mean, not only as an external member, but as a full-fledged member. And this progressive getting into the politics and the governance of the Eurozone has had the consequence to increase expectations vis-à-vis the European Central Bank, not only in terms of financial stability or stability of the euro, which, as you were saying, is the primary mandate of the European Central Bank, but in the way the ECB could contribute, could help policymakers in the Commission or among the member states to succeed in their policies. So one of the debate has been over the greening, for example, of policies. Now, to what extent can the ECB remain blind to the general Green Deal of the European institutions, the push for carbon-free objectives of the European Union, etc.? So in a way, to what extent does the ECB participate to the policies of the Union? So this is not a discussion that has been completely resolved so far. It's an ongoing controversy, again, about what does it mean to be an independent institution? What does it mean to be an independent central bank? Does it mean that the institution is independent from the European Union as a whole, as I think the creators of the European Central Bank hope to be? Does it mean that the European Central Bank is independent from the politicians of Europe? Or does it mean that the European Central Bank is independent from the policies of the European Union? So, of course, this is an ongoing discussion with a lot of different positions. As you know, the German Constitutional Court has been continuously claiming that the notion of independence of the European Central Bank should be interpreted in a very restricted meaning, because it's a derogation to the democratic principle and to the sovereignty of the member states. This from the Maastricht Treaty to the PSPP decision that the German Constitutional Court took during the COVID crisis. So, of course, the Court of Justice or the European Central Bank claims differently. So, we are in the European Union of crisis in which, the competence drift can be continuously, in a way, reopened. The notion of independence is critical.
Yeah, that's right. Because I guess, as you say, it's very much how does one interpret independence? Because, Draghi's famous words there, whatever it takes. On one hand, then you could say, well, he's under the pressure of national governments and financial markets. He has to act. The ECB has to act. That they're being pressured. They're not independent. On the other hand, I guess you could say, well, no, the ECB is showing exactly that it is so independent, it can do completely what it wants. And if it decides to help support the countries in lowering their debt levels or the rate that they can obtain debt at, then that's right. It is so independent that I think that's it. Like at one point, I was kind of, when I first thought about it, I was like, oh no, there's no way you could say that was an independent move, but maybe it was the ultimate independent move to say we'll do whatever it takes.
Well, what you can be sure about is that any of these controversies will happen. We'll have a sort of derivation or continuation over, a controversy over the notion of independence, and that's exactly what I'm and trying to say in the papers that this word we've been pronouncing so many times ever since the beginning of this podcast that I'm sorry for the people listening to this, but it's exactly this. I mean, we have a difficulty finding another word. And when we talk about the European Union as a polity, we continuously get back to that notion. And when we talk about the legitimacy, jurisdiction of the EU, it's the limits of its competencies, etc. Because precisely, the EU has been in large part built and reinforced by institutions such as the Court of Justice or the European Central Bank.
All right. Well, let's change it up for our poor listeners who've only heard the word independence. We're going to go to the word interdependence. This is for my last question for you. So I'd like to finish, as I say, I read whilst researching in the podcast today, a quote by Jose Manuel Barroso, the former president of the European Commission. And he said, interdependence is not a zero-sum game. It's a win-win situation where everyone benefits, but not everyone benefits equally. Do you think then that the EU by its very nature is predestined to continue having independence wars into perpetuity? Or will there be a time where the desire for interdependence trumps the desire for independence?
Well, that's a very complex question for a last question.
Very sorry.
Well, I mean, I think interdependence is a fact. I mean, it's something that has been incremental as a single market and all the European policies have unfolded over the past 7 decades or so. So interdependence is a fact. The question is, how do we govern interdependence? I mean, with what sort of political arrangement do we take in charge this interdependence that exists? We can deny it, but I don't think it's really feasible these days.
Probably not going to bring us very far, no.
What sort of political arrangement? So far, the political arrangement has been that, yes, we need to somehow handle this difficulty or this interdependence through independent institutions, through, in a way, overburdening independent institutions or creating new ones, such as the European Central Bank, for example. This has maybe come to a limit. I'm not the only one saying so, and I think the discussion has been going on for 1 or 2 decades now. The question is the extent to which the political field, the field of parties, the field of representative politics, particularly at the European Parliament, but also with national parliaments, can be the place where, these compromises that Barroso is referring to.
That's right, yes.
Are these transnational compromises of interest, which are not only compromises among member states, but also compromises among social classes or groups across the continent. So who is taking and who has the legitimacy to engage in this redistribution and in this settlement? I argue in the end that independent institutions have too narrow a legitimacy to be the ones taking that in charge, and that we can only think so far of parties and representative politics, but of course not at the transnational level. And this is where, in a way, the EU could be strengthened, because this is how a legitimate compromise can be built on the long run, not only in facing crises one after the other.
Okay, so I think you did very well there, answering my little last question curveball. I apologise for that, but that's right. That's it. As you say, there's still work to be done, but maybe one could move from this always reactive to maybe a proactive approach then on how we deal with independence and interdependence in the EU.
Yes, indeed.
Okay. Well, Antoine, thank you so much for coming on the show today. It was wonderful having you here. I've learned a lot. I hope our listeners have learned a lot too. As I say, for those who want to learn more about how to read the word independence even more often, then they can go to the link, which is going to be in the podcast description, which will take them directly to the open access version of your article. So, Antoine, as I say, thank you so much for coming on the Lawcast today.
Thank you, Chris. It was a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to the Lawcast. If you'd like more information about Max Planck Law, or if you'd like to get involved, please visit us at law.mpg.de.
Max Planck Law. Excellence in legal research.